Today I'm in Olympia visiting my friend Calvin Johnson here at K Records World Headquarters. I hear some guitar bleed through as we do the interview. Hey, Jack. Very cool. Well, good to reconnect.
Yeah.
Bruce Pavitt on the Jack Blood Show. Bruce, long time no talk. Great for being with us today. Thanks. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Jack. Stoked to be here.
So we just had a birthday for Kurt Cobain here on February 20th, and then the 20-year anniversary of Kurt's death is coming up. You have a new book out that is fantastic. I guess it's not that new, but it's still getting a lot of publicity, Experiencing Nirvana, Grunge in Europe.
Grunge in Europe, 1989. It's a photojournal of the last week of Nirvana's first European tour. They were traveling with the Tad Band, meeting up with Mudhoney to do a Sub Pop showcase in London. So the book basically captures the moment that Nirvana went from total obscurity to international rock stars.
A little bit surprising to all of us, Bruce. I'm sure you included. Did anybody think that Nirvana would be that big? I guess the story is no.
Absolutely not. But I'll tell you, by the time they hit their stride in early December of '89, their live show had really been fine-tuned, as well as some of their newer material. And I knew after winning over the British crowd in '89 that they would really go on to make a name for themselves.
Why does that remind me of Jimi Hendrix for some reason? He went to Europe to be discovered and then came back to America? It's not that Nirvana or grunge was discovered in Europe by any sense of the imagination, but it didn't hurt.
Well, I'll tell you, the British press has remained a very powerful voice in the international music community. And certainly the 80s, pre-internet in Seattle, it was very difficult to get any kind of media attention. So we decided to take the show on the road and get three of our best live bands to London. The New Music Express anointed Nirvana as Sub Pop's answer to the Beatles, which is a pretty good bit of hype.
Yeah, and a lot of people do make that correlation between Nirvana and the Beatles. You want to talk about that a little bit and maybe what the truth is versus the myth?
Well, I haven't really given it too much thought other than the fact that Cobain was a brilliant songwriter. Frankly, I think he kind of resonates in our society in the same way that maybe a John Lennon would. He was a sensitive, brilliant songwriter and singer, but he was also an activist and somebody who really spoke his mind. And to me, that's where the deeper connection lies.
Great songwriting and an amazing person. I think we can all attest to that, and a huge loss for the world, certainly. 20 years later, How is it that grunge is so big? Is it because music has been so bad since then, or what do you attribute to that, Bruce? Because when I was growing up, they used to call music that was 20 years old classic rock, and now it still sounds like it's new to a lot of kids coming up today.
Yeah, well, I think people are always looking for music that has kind of a rich emotional resonance, and frankly, I think so much music today, especially on pop radio, is rather soulless, and I think it's one of the reasons why Cobain and bands like Pearl Jam and Soundgarden still sound pretty good. I think at its core it was pretty soulful music, and I think it holds up pretty well.
That is experiencing Nirvana Grunge in Europe 1989. People can get this anywhere, right, Bruce? I don't need to plug a certain site for people to go to. What helps you the most?
I think most people go to Amazon.com. You can also go directly to the publisher, bazillionpoints.com, and you get a free poster and a badge if you go that route.
Amazing pictures. You took a lot of those yourself from on stage and backstage back in 1989, and some of these pictures never been seen before.
Yeah, I would say just about all of them. I took about 500 pictures when I was traveling that last week, and about 200 of them made the book. In addition, there's about 30 photos from London photographer Steve Double, who took some amazing black and white pro shots of all three bands at the Astoria at the Lame Fest show. So if you're a fan of the early 90s Seattle scene, late 80s Seattle scene, I think you're really going to love this book.
Grunge in Europe, and then coming back, there were a lot of bad things that did happen during that tour, right? It kind of pushed Kurt Cobain over the edge a little bit, and I guess you guys were there to kind of help him and reel him in. Do you want to tell any stories from the book that my listeners might not have heard before? Sure.
Well, aside from the fact that there's just some awesome photos of the band and Kurt, the photos are really laid out to tell a story, to share a narrative. When my business partner, John Poneman, and I first arrived in Europe, we landed in Rome. We had heard that Nirvana was suffering from exhaustion after zigzagging across Europe for 5 weeks. And Kurt Cobain in particular wound up having what I would characterize as a nervous breakdown on stage, smashed his last guitar, climbed a PA stack, threatened to jump. After the show, basically said the band was over, it was breaking up. My partner, John, took Kurt out and for a walk around the block and chilled him out and told him, look, we're going to pull you out of the van for a day. We're going to walk around Rome, chill out, and let's all try to get to London for this showcase, because the London showcase was really the key to the whole tour. That was the show that was going to broadcast the band's talents throughout the British media. It was absolutely crucial that Nirvana made it to that show, and I think by pulling Kurt out of the van for a day and spending time in Rome, it made all the difference. Nirvana came back together and basically blew everybody away in London. So that's the essential story.
It's super hard to explain the book, so people do have to get it. And let's talk a little bit about Sub Pop Records, if we can. I know I've recorded with Jack and Dino before. In fact, my band just did that this last July, and we all know what an awesome guy, what an amazing guy he is. But the first Nirvana album recorded for Sub Pop was Bleach. You had to be a little surprised how that changed everything. I tell you, at the time I was in a band in L.A., and I also had my band in Seattle. The band in L.A. instantly wanted to go grunge. It didn't matter what we were doing and how many offers we might have had and how good we might have been. Bleach changed absolutely everything. I think it's completely underestimated in the cultural effect it had on people. Take me back to those days and what you guys were thinking when that thing started to break.
Well, I'd really have to add Superfuzz Big Muff by Mudhoney in there. Jack and Dino had a particularly raw style of recording bands. His studio was a low-budget studio. We didn't pay a lot for the recordings, but he was a genius at capturing the rawness of the groups. And both Bleach and Superfuzz Big Muff by Mudhoney, I think, really captured the public's imagination.
The Superfuzz Big Muff, I think, is one of the best records ever made, quite frankly.
Totally.
Yeah, I mean...
Jack and Dino's a genius, I have to say. Nirvana's first record only cost $600 to record, and yet it sold over 2 million copies. Quite a testament to Jack's skills.
And he put up with us, too, which never was that easy. But just an amazing guy. Isn't it true that he could have went to any record label after all of that happened and really soaked in the big bucks, and he just never did? And that's amazing to me.
He never did. He's a man of great integrity. He's really stuck to his guns. He does fly around the world, recording bands. He's done quite a bit of work down in Brazil. He's always wanted to do things on his terms, record music in his style, and there was no way that he was going to compromise his sound and his vision for, let's say, major label interest.
Yeah. Your interest in the band Nirvana, for instance, the biggest band, and then Soundgarden, you guys kind of, what was it? You released a percentage of the master tapes, and then I believe we're compensated at some point by Geffen and the bigger record companies that took these guys, A&M and Geffen respectively. But I mean, you had to have been watching kind of like this is your child almost. And when you started seeing Kurt, for instance, running into all kinds of trouble, I mean, was there anything you could do at that point? Was there anything anyone could do? Because I knew a lot of those people too, and I wasn't going to dare be the guy that said anything.
Right. You're talking about after Kurt had left Geffen?
I'm talking about primarily once, specifically when he got together with Courtney, and then more specifically when fame began to become a problem for him.
Well, I'll tell you that Kurt classically was very reclusive, and once he went to Geffen and was spending time with Courtney, he was pretty hard to reach. He really didn't spend much time going out to shows and connecting with folks, so by nature, he was reclusive, and because of that, it was kind of hard to connect with him. One of the last times I saw him was right after his performance on Saturday Night Live. They had just sold 2 million records by that time, just played to America via Saturday Night Live, and he was in good spirits. He was really excited by his success, frankly, and was talking about how young kids are coming up and asking for his autograph, and I think he really enjoyed that.
It's kind of a double-edged sword. I think we would all know. I've often told my listeners that I was glad I didn't make it because it probably would have killed me too. It's so hard to deal with all the pressures, and I'll give him that.
Absolutely.
I can tell you, Bruce, and maybe I'll get in trouble saying this, but everyone in Seattle, pretty much to a man, laments the death of Kurt and, thinks about it as a suicide. I really dug into that thing, and I have a lot of questions. Am I out of line for saying that, or have you had in yourself some, weird gut feeling that we weren't told everything we should have been told about Kurt's suicide?
In short, yes. And interestingly enough, I just coincidentally, last week I bumped into Norm Stamper, who was the chief of police in Seattle at the time. Bumped into him at the airport, and he told me that if he knew now what he knew then, that he would have pursued the case further. He feels that there were some loose ends and was a little sloppy, and he is actively calling for a reopening of the case. There's a film that's coming out called Soaked in Bleach that's kind of a dramatic interpretation of the last few weeks of Kurt's life, and I think they're kind of opening up the case a little bit via popular culture. So who knows? I think in many people's minds it's a little unresolved.
Yeah, I mean, you're not going to go as far as to say that it wasn't a suicide, but certainly the investigation was tainted. I think it's fair to say. There were so many good things that were about to happen for him, and I know some personal things as well, and it didn't add up, and there was things like no fingerprints on the gun, and certainly, some of the people that were around him are not the most reputable people that have been involved in some really horrible things, and so it's not that hard, and then, I lived with Courtney Love for a while, so it's easy to understand, what a psycho she might be. Again, not wanting to go into Dylan Carlson or her too much, but it's interesting to hear you say that. And I know it's not something people like to talk about in Seattle. Why do you think that is?
Well, I don't know if I really want to elaborate on this topic too much more, Jack.
Yeah.
Other than to say, straight up, I did just speak to Norm Stamper from Seattle, who was a former chief of police, and he thinks the investigation was a little sloppy, and I think some people are starting to ask some questions, but it's an emotionally charged, complicated subject, and it's hard for me to talk about it right now, to be honest.
Yeah, no, I mean, that is it. I think for most people that were close to it you just kind of want to shut the book and move on because it is so horrible. and the loss was so great. Experiencing Nirvana Grunge in Europe, 1989, by Bruce Pavitt, Sub Pop Records. Bruce, let's talk about this. I know we got about 10 minutes left. You're a political guy. I know we, talk a little bit on Facebook, and we post some of the same things, and let's talk a little bit about the state of the world today. What is the state of the world in your opinion, and is it retrievable?
Well, fundamentally, I think what you've got going on here in the U.S. and what you're seeing in Europe in particular is accelerated wealth disparity. And that's really what it comes down to. And you can explain it any way you want, but that's where it's going. The 1% are getting richer and a lot of other people are getting squeezed out. And that really needs to be addressed in a pretty radical way.
Were you somebody that maybe thought that Barack Obama might be able to reverse this process? He's a guy our age. This is the first president I've had that's my age, that listened to the same music I did and smoked pot when he was a kid and other things we hear. And you look at it, and first black president, obviously, allegedly, that's a good thing. That's a good barrier to break. I actually voted for Cynthia McKinney in that election. She's a black woman. So, were you one of those people, though, that looked at it and went, okay, this has got to be better?
Yes. I voted for Barack Obama, and I have been, I think a lot of people I know have been just pretty disappointed with how things have unfolded, and it just seems that the powers that be are, have a real stranglehold on American politics, where corporations now can make unlimited donations to political campaigns. The whole system feels very corrupt. It feels like the only people making money are the banking industry, and that there's a lot of fraud and corruption in the financial industry, and it hasn't really been addressed. And I really do think that things are coming to a head, and that a lot of the fraud that's been behind this misallocation of resources is going to, I think it's just going to be exposed in a dramatic way here at some point, and people are going to realize that the system is fundamentally flawed, and that changes are going to have to be made. That's my core opinion.
Yeah. Well, so let's not pull any punches. You're a rich guy. What do you care? Is what people say, right?
Yeah, well, Jack, it's true. I did make some cash at one time, but I'll tell you, I went through a divorce right in the middle of the real estate crash. It's pretty harsh. So I got to feel what that whole misallocation of resources, what happened with that real estate crash, and it's something I've thought about quite a bit. But even if I did, quote unquote, have a lot of cash, it still wouldn't change the fact that there's accelerated wealth disparity in our society, and that's not good. That's not good for society as a whole.
Yeah, and it's difficult to know how to fix it other than just quit doing the same thing over and over again. You look at, flying death robots.
Yes. The whole drone, the drone thing.
The NSA thing.
NSA,
this is stuff I was talking about years ago, and people said I'm crazy to talk about it, but here it is. Now it's just a fact of life, and people don't even seem affected, man.
Yeah, it's shocking. Just the shredding of the Constitution that's happened, for sure. It's a big deal. And also, my background is in media and music. I've promoted decentralization of culture forever, supporting small labels, small media. And so one thing I've kept abreast of is just how centralized our news sources have become. Certainly the internet provides a lot of alternative voices, but as far as mainstream news and mainstream radio, there's fewer and fewer people controlling centralized media, and I think that's very, very dangerous.
Yeah, and well, that was done under the Clinton and Gore regime, by the way, folks. And the first Patriot Act was written after Oklahoma City, called the Crime Bill. So it's an equal opportunity, and we need to realize who these people are. In 2016, it's already looking like it's a Clinton versus Bush. I can't even imagine that people would be able to face that or to not see something wrong with that picture.
Right. So the fact that there's less true political dialogue in mainstream media, has everything to do with the ownership. And certainly there's voices such as yourselves and a lot of interesting voices on the internet, but they reach a much smaller group of people than these mainstream news shows.
Yeah, I always thought that we would be taking their place, but then they started stealing from us and putting their name on our work in order to give themselves credibility, which proves that if you get enough of consensus, you can get the mainstream media to report on things and even the establishment to move a little bit in your direction. The victories are numerous, and my listeners know that. Because I'm almost out of time, and I know you got to go. Bruce Pavitt with us. Get this book, Experiencing Nirvana, Grunge in Europe, 1989. Bruce, I haven't gotten it yet. It's just one of those things I'm waiting to give myself as a late Christmas present. I can't wait to get into it. Let's finish up on this. Where's the music industry today? You somebody that really embodies the do-it-yourself attitude, the whole coalition of people that had to come together to create this Seattle scene that is known and revered around the world is maybe a once-in-a-lifetime thing, some people may say. But look at the music industry today. When I was talking to Jack Andino a couple of months ago, he said, one thing he said to me that really stuck out was something to the effect that I used to know that all of the stuff I recorded would get out. Now I don't even know if it's going to reach an audience. There doesn't seem to be any infrastructure, and most people want their music for free. The record companies are folding. Little labels are folding constantly, as are little radio stations. And I think this is pretty important because the cultural revolution is way more effective than the political revolution. So I want to see it go forward, but I also want to see the artists get rewarded and compensated for their work. I think that's very important as an artist myself. So how do you see this fleshing out? Well, what is the future of the music industry, for instance, or the cultural industry in general?
Well, it's really all about the internet, and ultimately you can record something, post it on YouTube, and potentially get 1 million hits. Whether you're going to get compensated for that remains to be seen. However, if you're a performing artist and you're traveling and there's more and more people familiar with your work because of the internet, then you can leverage it that way. But as far as people paying for music, that's in decline, and it's sad to say. I have a couple teens in the house. They don't spend money on music. When I was a teenager, I spent all of my money on music. Yeah. They've got some Spotify accounts. They're streaming. They're listening to music, but they don't really sense it. They don't feel that they should really have to pay for it. And so it's a big challenge for sure. But as far as creating music and getting it out there, the digital age has allowed artists to be able to do that for fundamentally nothing. And that's the upside.
Yeah, that is definitely. Same with filmmaking and self-publishing a book and everything else. But if you want to write a second book or do a second record, obviously there has to be a couple of bucks in it for you so you can eat. That is the thing. It's
a very challenging time for sure, and I've been scratching my head on that one for a while.
I love how you were talking about decentralization, Bruce, and I'm a big decentralize and repeal guy because all laws are selectively enforced, in my humble opinion. I'm not really big on globalism, but it has helped music. And you look at Mudhoney today, and they go play for 50, 100,000 people in South America. So they're making a living. I mean, talk about that for a second.
Yeah, well, that's kind of what I was saying. The Internet's allowed more access to information, so there's a larger global audience for people's work, and hopefully that'll translate into good paid gigs. And Mudhoney is a perfect example.
So 20 years since the death of Kurt Cobain, you want to hypothesize? It's fun to think about. I like to think about what John Lennon would be doing today if he was still around. Not that I'm even comparing the two, or Jimi Hendrix for that matter. What would Kurt be doing today?
I think he'd still be writing music. When we first signed Nirvana, they really didn't have, I would say, any good material. The first single we put out was a cover song. And what I witnessed was the blossoming of Kurt's genius as a writer. He could write better. And I feel that if he had stayed alive, that he would have continued to come up with brilliant songs.
Yeah, and would he be socially or politically active, maybe even more than he was?
I believe politically active. Again, socially, he was very reclusive, but he was very willing to state his opinions. He was ahead of the curve on feminism and gay rights and all sorts of things. He was outspoken and kind of a revolutionary in his own right. I think there's a real resonance between him and somebody like John Lennon, who also spoke his mind. What's new with Sub Pop today? You're still involved in the label to some extent? I'm on the board of advisors, so I go in every once in a while and have lunch with my old business partner and talk music. There's a couple bands that I'm really excited about. In particular, there's a group called Mets from Toronto, who is kind of a noise rock trio. I love them. Puts on an absolute amazing live show. There's a hip-hop duo from Seattle, two women, called The Satisfaction. They put out a track called Queens last year that I think is really pretty original. So there's a diversity of music coming out of the label. I think they're going to be putting out a little more Seattle hip-hop, continuing to diversify and continuing to put out cool, interesting stuff.
Well, as one loser to another, I really appreciate you being on. That was their tagline there, folks. And I like to think of myself as an Irishman as one of the world's greatest losers. I think that's something that we can all really shoot for out there. Experiencing Nirvana, Grunge in Europe, 1999. There's actually a website called Experiencing Nirvana, experiencingnirvana.com. And Bruce Pavitt, Sub Pop. Great book, Bruce. I can't wait to read it. And I'm sorry our time is a little bit short today, but I appreciate you being with us.
Thank you very much. Take care, man.
All right,
bye-bye.
thanks.
And we want to get loaded.